The rumble of diesel engines shattered the morning silence as 3 dump trucks lined up to drive over my tiny bridge. The HOA president's plan to make it collapse on camera.
"Watch this unsafe junk crumble,"
she yelled, phone recording, as the first 40-ton monster rolled onto my grandfather's 127-year-old stone bridge spanning Willow Creek. The metallic clank mixed with her satisfied laugh. Here's what she didn't know. I'm a retired civil engineer who'd been quietly preparing for this exact moment. Every soil test around that riverbank, every calculation about weight distribution, every detail of what happens when arrogance meets physics. The creek mist clung to limestone as those mechanical beasts prepared to cross my family legacy. She had her camera, her audience, her expensive equipment. What she didn't have was any clue about the trap I'd set. What would you do if a power-hungry neighbor tried to demolish your family history with heavy machinery? Drop your state below. I want to see how far HOA tyranny has spread. I never thought retirement would involve guerrilla warfare against a woman who measured mailbox heights with a ruler and fined people for having the wrong shade of beige. At 52, I'd spent 30 years building massive concrete spans across Colorado's mountain passes, bridges that could handle convoy after convoy of 18-wheelers. Now I was defending a stone arch barely wide enough for my pickup truck. I'd moved to Millbrook Springs 6 months after Sarah's funeral, drawn by memories of childhood summers spent helping my grandfather maintain the limestone cottage overlooking Willow Creek. My property sprawled across 3 acres of former mining land, with the tiny bridge serving as the only access from the main road. All of 12 feet across and built by hand in 1897, it was my grandfather's masterpiece, each stone cut and fitted with the kind of patience modern construction had forgotten. Which was exactly the problem, according to Linda Pemberton and the Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. The morning mist still clung to the creek when I first encountered the neighborhood's self-appointed queen. I'd been kneeling beside the bridge foundation, running my hands along the mortar joints my grandfather had pointed nearly 70 years ago, when a white Lexus SUV pulled up with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd never been told no in her adult life. Historic stone arch bridges actually strengthen over time as mortar settles and stones compress together, creating self-supporting structures that outlast modern concrete by centuries. Sometimes, the oldest engineering is still the smartest engineering. Linda emerged wearing suburban authority-like armor, crisp blazer, clipboard, and that particular smile reserved for people she was about to systematically destroy. A former real estate agent who'd parlayed neighborhood networking into 8 years of HOA presidency, she radiated the confidence of someone who'd weaponized bureaucracy into a fine art. The cloying scent of vanilla perfume mixed with her idling SUV's exhaust as designer heels crunched across my gravel drive. Mr. Blackwood? Linda Pemberton, HOA president for 8 glorious years. She didn't offer her hand. I'm here about your infrastructure problem. I stood slowly, limestone dust on my palms from where I'd been checking the ancient stonework. At 6'2", I dwarfed her petite frame, but Linda had the kind of presence that suggested physical intimidation was amateur hour compared to what she could accomplish with the right paperwork. What infrastructure problem? This, she gestured at my family's bridge like it was roadkill. Residents are concerned about safety, property values, visual coherence with our community standards. The morning air carried the sound of creek water bubbling over smooth stones, the same sound 3 generations of Blackwood men had heard crossing this bridge to reach the cottage. Around them, the remnants of old Millbrook Springs were slowly disappearing, replaced by Linda's vision of suburban perfection. Most of the original mining cottages had been bulldozed for McMansions, with perfectly manicured lawns and HOA-approved landscaping. My grandfather's bridge was apparently the last piece of authentic history she hadn't managed to erase. It's historically protected and structurally sound, I replied evenly. I can provide engineering reports. Linda's smile sharpened like a blade. Oh, sweetie, I've done my homework. Historical protection only covers legitimate transportation infrastructure. This narrow little footpath hardly qualifies. It's not a footpath, it's rated for vehicle traffic. Vehicle traffic? Linda actually laughed, the sound harsh against the morning quiet. What vehicles? Golf carts? Bicycles built for 2? My neighbor's riding mower? That's when I understood. This wasn't about safety or building codes. This was about power. Linda had spent 8 years reshaping the neighborhood according to her aesthetic vision, forcing elderly residents to choose between expensive upgrades and selling their family homes to developers. I'll need current engineering assessments, insurance documentation, environmental impact studies for any creek modifications. Her pen scratched furiously across the clipboard. Oh, and load-bearing certifications for any vehicles planning to use this structure. The way she said structure, like she was discussing a pile of rubble, suggested she already had plans for testing those load limits herself. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday, thick cream paper that screamed official business, even before I opened it. The smell of expensive letterhead mixed with my morning coffee as I read Linda's declaration of war, written in the most bureaucratic language possible. Violation notice, number 2024-087. Non-compliance with community infrastructure standards, section 12.4.7. Structure fails to meet current safety protocols and aesthetic guidelines. Fine. $500, with daily penalties of $100 until compliance achieved. I read it twice, the bitter taste of injustice stronger than my coffee. $500 for owning a bridge my family had maintained for over a century. The accompanying photos showed my bridge from every conceivable angle, shot with forensic precision that would make crime scene photographers jealous. I'd learned enough about HOA tactics during my engineering career to know that most architectural review committees could only enforce rules clearly disclosed at purchase and properly recorded with county authorities. Retroactive aesthetic requirements usually violated state homeowner protection laws. When bureaucrats started making up rules as they went, they were typically standing on very shaky legal ground, both literally and figuratively. So I decided to fight fire with paperwork. If Linda wanted to play the bureaucracy game, I'd show her what real documentation looked like. 3 days later, I'd compiled a response that would make any engineer proud. Structural analysis reports dating back to 1962, county engineering assessments from 1987 and 2003, historical society documentation, even a letter from the Colorado Department of Transportation acknowledging the bridge's significant historical and engineering value. But Linda's retaliation came faster than a Colorado thunderstorm. The second violation notice arrived Friday, hand-delivered by a nervous teenager who probably earned minimum wage for Linda's dirty work. Violation number 2024-091. Failure to maintain approved landscaping standards around infrastructure. Wild vegetation creates safety hazards and diminishes property values. Fine. $300. I walked the bridge perimeter, morning dew soaking through my work boots as I tried to identify these supposed safety hazards. The wild mint growing along the creek banks, the native columbines my grandmother had planted in 1954. Apparently, Linda's vision of safety required eliminating anything that hadn't been purchased at a big box garden center. The phone rang that Saturday morning while I was photographing the hazardous wildflowers. Eleanor Hendricks's voice was elderly, but sharp as a steel blade. Mr. Blackwood, I wanted you to know that Linda came by yesterday asking very specific questions about your bridge, whether I'd noticed any structural problems during heavy weather, whether I'd seen any concerning vehicle traffic crossing it. What did you tell her? Eleanor's chuckle crackled through the phone. I told her I've been crossing that bridge twice a week for 43 years to visit my sister's grave, and it's held up better than most of the marriages in this neighborhood. She asked if I'd ever seen large vehicles test its limits. The words sent a chill down my spine. Large vehicles? What was Linda planning? She also mentioned something about bringing in professional assessment equipment to properly evaluate load-bearing capacity, Eleanor continued. Thought you should know she's not just collecting complaints, she's researching something specific. Monday brought violation notice number 3, targeting the bridge's inadequate lighting and missing safety barriers. But buried in the fine print was something new. Structure must be certified for emergency vehicle access or face immediate closure pending safety evaluation. Emergency vehicles? My engineering mind started calculating. Standard fire trucks weighed around 35,000 pounds, ambulances maybe 15,000. But what if Linda decided to test those limits with something heavier? I called the county engineering department immediately. Bridge inspection? For a private structure? The clerk sounded surprised. That's unusual, but we can schedule someone. What if it was built in 1897 and might qualify for historic landmark status? Oh, that changes everything. We have a specialist who handles historic preservation. Could get someone out this week. When County Inspector Dale Morrison arrived Wednesday morning, I watched a fellow engineer fall in love with craftsmanship. Morrison spent 2 hours documenting the stonework, his camera shutter mixing with bird songs and creek water as he marveled at century-old construction techniques. This is museum-quality work, Morrison said, running calloused hands along the fitted arches. Your grandfather was an artist. These joints are tighter than most modern construction I inspect. The official report arrived that afternoon like Christmas morning. Structure exceeds current safety standards and qualifies for immediate historic landmark protection. Recommend preservation rather than modification. I printed 3 copies and hand-delivered one to Linda's house. She answered in a silk robe, clearly not expecting visitors. The vanilla perfume was stronger here, mixing with cigarette smoke and what definitely smelled like boxed wine. "Mr. Blackwood, how unexpected." "County inspection results," I said, handing over the report with an engineer's satisfied smile. Linda's manicured fingers gripped the document, her expression darkening like storm clouds. When she reached the landmark recommendation, her knuckles went white. "This doesn't change anything," she said coldly. "Historical protection has limits. Safety concerns override historic value." "What safety concerns?" "The inspector found it structurally superior to modern standards." "Mr. Blackwood, you don't understand neighborhood governance." Her real estate agent mask slipped, revealing something harder underneath. "This community has standards. Your structure represents a liability we can't afford." The door closed with expensive finality, but I had heard something important. The way she said liability, like she was already calculating damages, combined with Eleanor's warning about professional assessment equipment and large vehicles, a disturbing picture was forming. Linda wasn't just trying to fine me into submission. She was planning something that would require testing my bridge's load-bearing capacity with heavy equipment. The question was, what kind of equipment did she have in mind? I got my answer sooner than expected. Thursday morning brought the sound of diesel engines rumbling down my quiet street at 6 a.m., their deep mechanical growls mixing with the peaceful chirping of birds who clearly hadn't signed up for this industrial invasion. Through my bedroom window, I watched a convoy that looked like it belonged on a highway construction site. 3 massive dump trucks, a concrete mixer, and what appeared to be a portable crane. The acrid smell of diesel exhaust began overwhelming the sweet scent of Morning Creek mist as the vehicles parked across from my property line, engines idling with the patient menace of predators waiting for the right moment to strike. By the time I threw on clothes and made it outside, Linda was already directing traffic, like a general, positioning artillery for siege warfare. She wore an actual hard hat, bright yellow and obviously brand new, and carried a clipboard thick enough to use as body armor. The morning air now reeked of diesel fumes and Linda's signature vanilla perfume, a combination that should have violated several environmental protection laws. "Morning, Mr. Blackwood," she called out, with the kind of cheerful malice usually reserved for people about to foreclose on orphanages. "Just conducting some infrastructure assessments, making sure our neighborhood can handle emergency response situations." "Emergency response?" I gestured toward the industrial equipment lineup. "What emergency requires a concrete mixer and 3 dump trucks?" "Oh, we're being very thorough. Testing various load capacities, stress tolerances, that sort of technical stuff." She waved dismissively, as if physics were just another bureaucratic formality she could override with the right paperwork. The lead dump truck driver, a weathered man in his 50s who clearly knew the difference between legitimate construction work and whatever fresh hell this was supposed to be, climbed down from his cab and approached Linda with obvious reluctance. The metallic clang of his steel-toed boots on asphalt echoed across the quiet morning. "Ma'am, I gotta ask again, are you sure about this? That bridge looks pretty narrow for what you're wanting us to do." "I'm paying you to drive, not to think," Linda snapped, her HOA president voice cutting through the morning air like a rusty blade. "The structure claims to be rated for vehicle traffic. Time to prove it can handle real vehicles." I felt every engineering instinct I'd developed over 30 years screaming warnings. Those dump trucks had to weigh at least 40 tons fully loaded, maybe more. My grandfather's bridge was solid as bedrock, but it was designed for 1897 traffic patterns. Horse-drawn wagons, the occasional Model T, maybe a pickup truck on its best day. Not industrial equipment that belonged on interstate construction projects. During my career, I'd learned that the most catastrophic engineering failures usually happened when someone ignored basic load calculations in favor of wishful thinking. Linda's plan was like trying to land a Boeing 747 on a neighborhood street, because technically, both were paved surfaces rated for vehicles. "Linda, you need to understand the engineering limits here," I called out, trying to keep my voice calm despite watching someone prepare to potentially destroy my family heritage. "That bridge wasn't designed for industrial loads." "Then maybe it shouldn't claim to be a vehicular bridge," she replied with the kind of sweet venom that real estate agents use to close difficult sales. "According to your own documentation, it's rated for continuous vehicle use. Well, these are vehicles." The first dump truck lurched forward with the grinding rumble of a mechanical dinosaur coming to life. I watched in horrified fascination as 80,000 pounds of steel and gravel approached my family's century-old stonework, the truck's massive tires leaving deep impressions in Linda's own perfectly manicured asphalt. The driver was clearly nervous, creeping forward at maybe 2 miles per hour, while Linda documented everything on her phone like she was filming the engineering equivalent of a public execution. But something unexpected happened. Instead of my bridge failing, it was Linda's brilliant plan that started falling apart faster than her HOA's credibility. The lead truck made it exactly halfway across before the driver hit the brakes and refused to continue. "This is insane!" he shouted through his window. "The whole approach is shifting." Except the bridge itself wasn't moving at all. I could see from my angle that the stonework was rock solid, steady as the day my grandfather had finished it. What was failing was the approach road, built on creekside fill dirt that Linda's own HOA had installed over old creek bottom. My grandfather had built the bridge on bedrock foundation that had been there since the last ice age. But the approach roads on both sides were just gravel and dirt over what used to be swampy creek bottom. Stable enough for normal traffic, but definitely not engineered for industrial loads that belonged on highway construction sites. "Keep going!" Linda screamed at the driver, her clipboard waving like a battle flag. "It's holding fine!" "Lady, I can feel the ground moving under my wheels." The driver was absolutely right. I could see hairline cracks spiderwebbing through the asphalt approach, where Linda's HOA had done a beautification project just 2 years earlier. The dump truck was literally too heavy for the infrastructure Linda's own organization had built. While she continued arguing with increasingly reluctant drivers, my engineering mind was running rapid calculations. Creekbed soil was mostly clay and sand, stable when dry, but this had been an unusually wet spring. Add 40 tons of sudden pressure to saturated soil, and basic physics suggested Linda was about to receive a very expensive education in load distribution principles. Eleanor appeared at my elbow like a neighborhood fairy godmother. "Whole streets watching from their windows," she whispered. "Linda applied for some kind of emergency infrastructure permit last week. Also, my grandson works for the county. He says she's been asking about load testing protocols for private bridges. Emergency infrastructure permit. That explained how Linda had gotten permission for this industrial circus. But permits couldn't suspend the laws of physics, and physics was about to render its final verdict on Linda's brilliant plan. The second dump truck driver had climbed out entirely and was walking around his vehicle, shaking his head like a man who'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended. "Ma'am, I think we need to call this off. The approach road's not rated for this kind of load. The approach road is perfectly fine." Linda's voice was climbing toward frequencies that probably violated noise ordinances. "The problem is that ancient death trap." But even as she said it, I could see reality dawning in her eyes like a slow-motion car crash. The bridge itself was holding perfectly, solid, immovable, exactly like my grandfather had built it to be. It was her own HOA's roadwork that was failing the test spectacularly. Still, Linda wasn't the type to admit defeat gracefully, especially not in front of half the neighborhood. She pulled out her phone and made a call, pacing back and forth with the agitated energy of someone whose master plan was unraveling in real time. "Yes, I need bigger equipment," I heard her say into the phone. "Something that can really test structural limits. Money's no object." I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. If Linda was willing to escalate to even heavier equipment, this situation was about to become genuinely dangerous. My little stone bridge might be built like a medieval fortress, but even fortresses had limits. And Linda seemed absolutely determined to find those limits the hard way. Linda's phone call apparently worked magic, because Friday morning brought equipment that made the previous day's convoy look like a toy collection. I counted 2 additional dump trucks, these ones military surplus monsters that probably weighed 60 tons empty, plus a bulldozer, and something that looked suspiciously like a wrecking ball on wheels. The smell of burning diesel fuel now permanently hung over the creek like an industrial fog, mixing with the sound of hydraulic systems groaning under pressure, as Linda's hired army prepared for what could only be described as total warfare against my 127-year-old stone arch. Eleanor knocked on my door at 7 a.m., carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the grim expression of someone delivering bad news. "My grandson called from the county office," she said without preamble. "Linda's applied for an emergency demolition permit, claims your bridge poses imminent danger to public safety and needs immediate removal." I felt my stomach drop. Emergency permits could override normal review processes, especially if someone knew the right people to call. And Linda had 8 years of neighborhood politics to build those connections. "There's more," Eleanor continued. "She's hired Consolidated Development Corporation to handle the emergency infrastructure replacement. They're the same company that built most of the subdivision." That name hit me like a physical blow. During my engineering career, I'd seen CDC's work. Cheap, fast construction that looked good for about 5 years before serious problems started appearing. They specialized in maximizing profit while minimizing anything that resembled actual structural integrity. Looking out my window at the assembled equipment, I realized Linda's strategy was becoming crystal clear. She couldn't win through legal channels, so she was going to create an emergency situation that would justify immediate action. The heavy equipment wasn't just for testing, it was positioning for demolition. My phone rang while I was processing this information. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Blackwood? This is Jake Morrison from the county engineer's office. Dale's my uncle. He wanted me to give you a heads up that someone's been asking questions about overriding historic protection status in emergency situations." I thanked Jake and hung up, my mind racing through the implications. Linda wasn't just planning to test my bridge to destruction. She was setting up legal justification for demolishing it afterward. The sound of air brakes hissing announced another arrival. This time it was a genuine mobile crane, the kind used for major construction projects. Its arrival sparked a minor traffic jam as neighbors emerged from houses to witness what was beginning to resemble preparation for siege warfare. Linda stood in the middle of it all like a general reviewing troops, her hard hat now accessorized with what appeared to be a full construction supervisor outfit. The vanilla perfume had been replaced by the practical scent of work boots and determination. "Mr. Blackwood," she called out when she spotted me, "I wanted to personally inform you that we've identified serious structural deficiencies in your bridge. For public safety, we'll need to conduct comprehensive load testing today." Comprehensive load testing was obviously code for destruction by heavy equipment. I could see the plan now. Load my bridge until something gave way, then claim emergency authority to demolish the dangerous structure and replace it with something more aesthetically pleasing. What Linda didn't know was that I had spent the previous evening making some calculations of my own. Not about my bridge. I knew that would hold up to anything short of actual explosives. But the creek bed around the bridge was a different story entirely. Spring runoff had been heavy this year, saturating the soil along both banks. The approach roads were built on what used to be marshland, filled in when the subdivision was developed. Under normal conditions, stable enough. But under the kind of loads Linda was planning to apply, the ground itself would become the weak point. I had also been doing some research into Linda's background. Turned out her real estate license had been suspended twice for aggressive sales practices and failure to disclose material facts. She'd also been involved in 3 previous HOA disputes that ended with expensive legal settlements. The pattern was becoming clear. Linda didn't solve problems. She escalated them until someone else had to pay the cleanup costs. Around noon, the serious equipment began positioning itself. The military surplus dump trucks lined up like tanks preparing for assault, while the crane positioned its boom to provide lifting assistance for anything that might need removal. I watched from my porch, sipping coffee and running calculations in my head. The combined weight of Linda's equipment convoy probably exceeded 400 tons. My grandfather's bridge could theoretically handle that load, but the creek banks definitely couldn't. Linda was about to discover that sometimes the most effective way to prove your point was to let your opponent's overconfidence do the work for you. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Bridge inspection scheduled Monday. Historic preservation specialist recommends no heavy vehicle testing until full structural analysis complete. County Engineering Department. I smiled and forwarded the message to Linda's phone number, which I'd found conveniently listed on every violation notice she'd sent me. Her response came back within minutes. "Monday's too late. Public safety requires immediate action." Which basically translated to, "I've committed too much money to this circus to stop now." I finished my coffee and went inside to make a phone call of my own. If Linda was determined to test the limits of physics, I wanted to make sure someone with authority was documenting the results. Emergency situations had a way of creating expensive liability questions, especially when they involved heavy equipment, saturated soil, and people who confused stubbornness with engineering expertise. Eleanor arrived Saturday morning with a manila folder thick enough to use as a doorstop, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of someone who just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "You're going to want to see this," she said, settling into my kitchen chair with the deliberate care of someone carrying explosives. My late husband kept every HOA document from the past 10 years. Turns out Linda's been very busy with other people's money. I poured coffee while Eleanor spread papers across my table, like evidence at a crime scene. Bank statements, contractor invoices, board meeting minutes, a paper trail that told a story of systematic financial manipulation, spanning nearly 3 years. "Started noticing discrepancies about 18 months ago," Eleanor explained, pointing to highlighted sections. "Infrastructure improvement fees that never seemed to result in actual improvements. emergency assessments for projects that somehow cost twice their original estimates. I studied the documents, my engineering mind automatically calculating the numbers. The HOA had collected over $400,000 in special assessments since Linda became president, but actual improvements totaled maybe half that amount. The rest had disappeared into a maze of consulting fees, administrative costs, and payments to companies with suspiciously similar names. Here's the interesting part, Eleanor continued, sliding a bank statement across the table. Linda's been receiving monthly payments from Consolidated Development Corporation, $1,500 every month for neighborhood liaison services, whatever that means. The pieces clicked together in my mind like a perfectly engineered mechanism. Linda hadn't been trying to destroy my bridge out of petty tyranny. She'd been working for CDC all along, systematically removing obstacles to their development plans. CDC has been buying properties along the creek for 2 years, Eleanor continued, always at below-market prices, usually from elderly residents who couldn't afford Linda's escalating violation fines. My neighbor Mrs. Peterson sold last month after Linda hit her with $8,000 in penalties for non-compliant flower beds. I felt anger rising in my chest like steam pressure. Linda hadn't just been targeting my bridge, she'd been systematically driving out long-time residents to clear land for development. The bridge was simply the last piece of authentic neighborhood history, standing in the way of CDC's plans. There's more, Eleanor said, producing another set of documents. The emergency demolition permit? It's not for public safety. It's the first step in a creekside shopping complex that CDC's been planning since last year. Your bridge property is the keystone, holding up the entire project. The development plans were impressive in their scope and appalling in their implications. CDC wanted to redirect Willow Creek into underground culverts, fill in the natural creek bed, and build a retail complex with parking for 500 cars. My 3-acre property, with its historic bridge and direct creek access, was the only thing preventing them from obtaining the necessary environmental permits. "How did you get all this?" I asked. Eleanor smiled with the innocent expression of someone who'd spent 60 years perfecting the art of being underestimated. "Linda's not very good with computers. She prints everything and throws the drafts in her regular trash. My grandson works for the county, and he mentioned that CDC submitted preliminary plans months ago. I studied the development timeline, cross-referencing it with the escalation of Linda's harassment campaign. Every major fine, every violation notice, every emergency inspection corresponded exactly with CDC's project milestones. She's been systematically clearing the neighborhood for development, I said, more to myself than Eleanor. The bridge isn't just about aesthetics or safety. It's about removing the last legal barrier to a multi-million-dollar project. Gets worse, Eleanor said, producing the final document. Linda leveraged her personal assets to buy CDC stock last year. If this project gets approved, she stands to make nearly $500,000. If it fails because of your bridge, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Linda had bet everything on this development project. The harassment, the violation notices, the heavy equipment circus. It was all the desperate actions of someone who couldn't afford to lose. I looked out my window at the industrial equipment still parked across the street, understanding finally dawning. Linda wasn't just fighting for control or aesthetics. She was fighting for her financial survival, and desperate people with heavy equipment made very dangerous opponents. I spent Saturday evening in my grandfather's workshop, surrounded by engineering textbooks and soil composition charts, planning something that would have made the old man proud. Not revenge, exactly. More like letting physics handle the conversation Linda had started. The key was understanding what Linda didn't, the difference between structural integrity and soil stability. My bridge was built on bedrock that had been there since glaciers carved out the creek valley. But the access roads on both sides? Linda's own HOA had built those over filled creek bottom, using the cheapest possible materials. I pulled out my surveying equipment and spent Sunday morning taking measurements. Soil composition, drainage patterns, load distribution points. What I discovered was even better than I'd hoped. The approach road on Linda's side was built over what used to be a natural creek bend, essentially a sand and clay mixture, held together by optimism and a thin layer of asphalt. During my engineering career, I'd learned that the most elegant solutions usually involved letting natural forces do the heavy lifting. Water, gravity, physics. They were all more powerful than any machine, and infinitely more patient. The creek had been running high all spring, saturating the ground underneath Linda's approach road. Add the weight of several loaded dump trucks, and basic soil mechanics suggested the road would fail long before my bridge showed any stress. The beauty was that Linda's own equipment would trigger its own destruction, but I needed to ensure two things: that no one got hurt, and that Linda's failure would be spectacular enough to end this harassment permanently. I spent Monday morning installing what appeared to be routine drainage maintenance around my property. In reality, I was creating a controlled water diversion that would maximize soil saturation directly under the approach road. Nothing illegal or dangerous, just basic creek management that would enhance natural drainage patterns. From my engineering textbooks, I remembered that clay soil lost about 60% of its load-bearing capacity when fully saturated. The approach road was rated for maybe 20 tons under ideal conditions. Linda's equipment convoy weighed over 400 tons total. The math was beautifully simple. Heavy equipment plus saturated clay equals very expensive physics demonstration. I also made some strategic phone calls. First to Dale Morrison at the County Engineering Department, mentioning concerns about unauthorized heavy vehicle testing on residential infrastructure. Then to the local Environmental Protection Office, noting possible creek disturbance from industrial activity in a protected watershed. Finally, I called Channel 7 News, where my neighbor's daughter worked as a weekend reporter. Might be an interesting story developing in Millbrook Springs, I mentioned casually. HOA president trying to destroy historic bridge with heavy equipment. Could be worth sending a camera crew. The trick was timing. I needed all the pieces in position when Linda made her move, which my research suggested would be Tuesday morning. She'd applied for a one-day emergency permit, clearly planning to complete her testing before any official oversight could interfere. Monday evening, I made final preparations. Security cameras positioned to document everything from multiple angles. Emergency contact numbers programmed into my phone. A clear evacuation route planned in case Linda's equipment caused more damage than anticipated. Most importantly, I calculated the exact point where loaded dump trucks would cause maximum soil failure. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Linda would destroy her own equipment by driving it exactly where physics predicted it couldn't be supported. I also prepared documentation proving my bridge's legitimate historic status, structural integrity reports, and evidence of Linda's systematic harassment campaign. When this was over, I wanted to ensure she faced appropriate legal consequences for her actions. The irony wasn't lost on me that Linda's own HOA infrastructure would be what destroyed her equipment. The approach road she'd approved, the drainage system she'd supervised, the soil composition she'd never bothered to investigate. All of it would combine to create a perfect demonstration of why engineers don't let real estate agents make structural decisions. Tuesday morning arrived with perfect weather for a physics lesson. Clear skies, no wind, excellent visibility for documentation. I positioned myself on my porch with coffee and my camera, ready to watch Linda learn some expensive lessons about load-bearing calculations. The key to the plan's success was that I wouldn't need to do anything active. No sabotage, no interference, no illegal activity. I'd simply created conditions where Linda's own poor decisions would have natural consequences. Physics was about to become very expensive for someone who'd spent months ignoring engineering advice. Eleanor knocked on my door at 7 a.m., carrying her own camera and wearing the expression of someone about to witness justice served with scientific precision. "Ready for the show?" she asked. I smiled, checking my phone one last time. County inspector, environmental officer, and news crew all confirmed to arrive by 8 a.m. Perfect timing for Linda's scheduled comprehensive load testing. "Let's see what happens when an unstoppable ego meets immovable physics," I replied. Tuesday morning brought Linda's final assault with military precision and the subtle grace of a freight train collision. By 6 a.m., her equipment convoy had doubled in size, now including what appeared to be an actual demolition crane and 2 additional military surplus dump trucks that probably violated several international treaties. The diesel fumes were so thick that I could taste them in my coffee, a metallic tang that mixed with the morning creek mist to create an industrial fog worthy of a dystopian nightmare. From my porch, I watched Linda coordinate her mechanical army with the manic energy of someone who'd bet everything on one roll of loaded dice. "Today we settle this once and for all," she announced to her hired drivers, her voice carrying across the water with the authority of someone completely convinced of their own righteousness. She traded her usual blazer for full construction gear, hard hat, safety vest, work boots that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The first dump truck rumbled forward at exactly 7:30 a.m., its 80,000-pound bulk approaching my tiny bridge with the inexorable momentum of a natural disaster. I noted with professional interest that the driver looked increasingly uncomfortable as he reached the approach road, clearly feeling the ground shift beneath his wheels. "Keep going," Linda shouted, waving her clipboard like a battle flag. "We need to test maximum load capacity." What happened next was physics in its purest, most unforgiving form. The lead truck made it exactly 3/4 of the way across the approach road before the asphalt began cracking like ice under pressure. The driver hit his brakes, but momentum and gravity had already taken control. I watched in fascination as 80,000 pounds of steel and gravel began a slow-motion slide toward Willow Creek, the truck tilting sideways as Linda's carefully paved approach road turned into something resembling quicksand. The driver abandoned his cab with impressive agility, jumping clear just as his vehicle completed its transformation from heavy equipment into very expensive boat anchor. "What the hell just happened?" Linda screamed at no one in particular, her carefully planned demonstration collapsing faster than her HOA's credibility. The second truck driver, displaying wisdom born of hard experience, refused to follow his colleague into what was rapidly becoming an industrial swamp. "Ma'am, that road's not stable. I'm not putting my equipment in there." "The road is fine," Linda insisted, even as evidence to the contrary continued settling into the creek bottom. "It's that bridge causing structural problems." I had to admire her commitment to alternate reality. Even with one dump truck clearly stuck in failed roadway, Linda was still blaming my perfectly intact bridge for her engineering disasters. County Inspector Dale Morrison arrived at exactly 8 a.m., his timing so perfect that I suspected divine intervention. Morrison took one look at the industrial chaos and immediately began documenting everything, with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen this movie before. "Ma'am, you're going to need to shut this operation down immediately," Morrison told Linda, his voice carrying the authority of someone who actually understood construction regulations. "This appears to be unpermitted heavy vehicle testing on inadequate infrastructure." "I have an emergency permit." Linda waved papers that were already looking less impressive in the morning light. "Emergency permits don't override basic safety requirements," Morrison replied calmly, "and they definitely don't authorize equipment that exceeds road weight limits." While Linda argued with growing desperation, I noticed Channel 7's news van arriving with perfect timing. Reporter Jessica Adrian emerged with her cameraman, immediately focusing on the dump truck that was now settling deeper into the saturated approach road. "This is Jessica Adrian, reporting live from Millbrook Springs, where an HOA dispute has turned into an environmental disaster," she announced to her camera, capturing Linda's meltdown for the evening news. The third dump truck driver, clearly recognizing a doomed operation when he saw one, began unhitching his trailer and preparing to leave. "Ma'am, I need payment for today, and I'm keeping my equipment on solid ground." "You can't leave." Linda's voice was reaching frequencies that probably violated noise ordinances. "We have work to finish." "Work's finished," the driver replied with the flat finality of someone who'd reached his limit. "Roads shot, equipment stuck, and county's shutting us down. Time to call it a day." I watched Linda's carefully constructed plan unravel with the inexorable logic of a controlled demolition. Her emergency permit was worthless, her equipment was stuck or departing, her road was destroyed, and her actions were being documented by both county officials and local media. Eleanor appeared beside me with fresh coffee and a satisfied smile. "How's that working out for her?" she asked, nodding toward Linda's increasingly frantic attempts to salvage her operation. "About like you'd expect when someone tries to use brute force to solve an engineering problem," I replied, watching Linda argue with the crane operator who was now refusing to attempt equipment recovery from unstable ground. Physics had rendered its verdict on Linda's approach to problem solving, and the results were being broadcast live on local television. The only question remaining was whether Linda would accept defeat gracefully or double down on disaster with even more spectacular results. Linda's answer came Wednesday morning in the form of equipment that made everything she'd brought previously look like children's toys. A genuine demolition crane, the kind used for dismantling skyscrapers, rumbled down the residential street at 6 a.m., followed by what appeared to be a concrete pumper truck and two additional pieces of machinery I couldn't immediately identify. The sound was like mechanical thunder rolling through the quiet neighborhood, rattling windows and triggering car alarms, as Linda's hired army prepared for what could only be described as total warfare against a stone arch built when Grover Cleveland was president. Eleanor knocked on my door, holding a fresh pot of coffee, and wearing the grim expression of someone watching a neighbor's complete mental breakdown. "She mortgaged her house," Eleanor announced without preamble. "My grandson saw the paperwork at the county office. Linda borrowed $300,000 against her property to pay for all this equipment." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Desperate people with heavy machinery were dangerous enough, but desperate people with everything to lose were absolutely unpredictable. Linda had moved beyond harassment and escalated to financial suicide, with my bridge serving as the target for her self-destruction. "There's more," Eleanor continued, settling into the porch chair that had become her observation post. "CDC's development permit expires Friday. If your bridge is still standing, their entire project gets delayed another year while they restart the environmental review process." That explained the sudden escalation to demolition equipment. Linda wasn't just fighting for her personal finances anymore. She was racing against a legal deadline that could cost her corporate partners millions of dollars. The demolition crane positioned its massive boom directly over my bridge, the operator clearly uncomfortable with what he was being asked to do. I could see him arguing with Linda, gesturing toward the historic stonework and shaking his head repeatedly. "Ma'am, I can't just demolish a structure without proper permits and environmental clearance," the operator called down from his cab. "This thing looks like it's protected by historic preservation laws." "It's an emergency situation," Linda shouted back, her voice carrying the desperate edge of someone watching their entire life implode in real time. "The structure is an imminent safety hazard." "Then why are you standing right next to it?" It was a reasonable question that Linda chose to ignore. Instead, she pulled out her phone and made what sounded like increasingly frantic calls to various contractors, county officials, and probably anyone else who might help her salvage this industrial disaster. I could hear fragments of her conversations. Money's no object. Immediate demolition. Safety emergency. Property values. The concrete pumper truck began extending its articulated arm toward the bridge, apparently planning to dump several tons of cement directly onto the stone arch. I realized Linda had moved beyond trying to prove the bridge was unsafe. She was planning to make it unsafe by burying it in concrete. County Inspector Morrison arrived with backup this time, bringing 2 additional officials and what appeared to be a sheriff's deputy. The sight of law enforcement seemed to increase Linda's desperation rather than discourage it. "You need to shut down this operation immediately," Morrison announced through a bullhorn. "This activity violates multiple county ordinances and state environmental protection laws." "I have emergency authority," Linda screamed back, waving papers that looked increasingly irrelevant as her equipment operators began backing their machinery away from the bridge. "Emergency authority doesn't override federal historic preservation statutes," the deputy replied calmly. "And it definitely doesn't authorize concrete dumping in protected waterways." I watched Linda's carefully constructed authority crumble as her hired operators began abandoning their equipment. The crane operator climbed down from his cab and approached Morrison with obvious relief. "Sir, I want it on record that I refuse to demolish this structure," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Lady's been pressuring us to do things that ain't legal or safe." That's when Linda made her final, desperate decision. Kimming into the cab of the concrete pumper truck herself, she began attempting to operate equipment she clearly didn't understand. The massive truck lurched forward with grinding mechanical protests as Linda tried to figure out controls designed for professional operators. "Ma'am, step away from that equipment," Morrison shouted through his bullhorn. "You're not qualified to operate heavy machinery." But Linda was beyond listening to safety warnings or legal advice. The concrete pumper truck jerked forward again, its articulated arm swinging wildly as she fought with controls that required years of training to master safely. I realized with growing horror that Linda had moved completely beyond rational decision-making. She was going to attempt to destroy my bridge personally, using equipment she couldn't control, in front of county officials and law enforcement. It was about to become genuinely dangerous for everyone involved. Eleanor grabbed my arm. "Maybe we should move back a bit further," she suggested, her voice tight with concern. I nodded, watching Linda wrestle with machinery that could kill someone if operated incorrectly. This had moved far beyond property disputes and neighborhood politics. Linda had reached the point where physics was about to deliver very harsh lessons about the consequences of operating equipment beyond your competence level. What happened next was physics in its purest, most unforgiving form, served with a side of poetic justice that would have made my engineering professors weep with pride. Linda managed to get the concrete pumper truck moving forward, its massive bulk approaching the already compromised approach road with the inexorable momentum of a small earthquake. The truck weighed approximately 60 tons when loaded, and Linda was driving it like someone who'd learned vehicle operation from watching cartoons. "This ends today," she screamed through the truck's window, her voice mixing with the grinding protest of hydraulic systems being operated by someone who clearly thought engineering was just another form of bureaucracy she could override. I watched in fascination as Linda positioned the massive concrete truck directly over the weakest point of the approach road, the exact spot where my calculations had predicted maximum soil failure. She couldn't have chosen a better location if she'd studied my engineering reports personally. County Inspector Morrison was shouting into his radio, calling for additional emergency vehicles as Linda's industrial rampage entered its final phase. The morning air filled with the sound of sirens approaching from multiple directions, creating a soundtrack worthy of a disaster movie. "Ma'am, that road cannot support that vehicle," Morrison called through his bullhorn, his voice carrying the authority of someone who actually understood load-bearing calculations. Linda's response was to gun the concrete truck's engine, apparently believing that momentum could overcome basic physics. The truck lurched forward onto the approach road with a grinding roar that seemed to shake the entire creek valley. For exactly 3.7 seconds, it looked like Linda's desperate gambit might actually work. The truck's massive weight distributed across the approach road, heading directly toward my tiny bridge with enough force to potentially damage even century-old stonework. Then, physics remembered who was actually in charge of this situation. The approach road, built over filled creek bottom and saturated by spring runoff, simply gave up trying to support 60 tons of concrete truck, operated by someone having a complete nervous breakdown. The asphalt cracked with sounds like gunshots as the entire roadway began settling into the creek bed below. I watched in perfect engineering fascination as the concrete truck tilted backward, its rear wheels sinking into what had been solid pavement moments before. The truck's articulated concrete boom swung wildly as Linda fought controls that no longer had any connection to reality. "Get out of the truck!" Morrison shouted, but Linda was apparently committed to riding her mechanical disaster all the way to its inevitable conclusion. The concrete pumper truck completed its transformation from construction equipment to very expensive river obstruction in roughly 12 seconds of mechanical chaos. The rear of the truck disappeared entirely into the failed approach road, while the cab tilted skyward at an angle that would have been comical if it weren't so dangerous. Linda finally abandoned her position when creek water began flowing through the truck's open door, scrambling out just as her $200,000 piece of equipment settled into its new permanent position as the world's most expensive creek bottom decoration. Channel 7's news crew captured everything in high definition, Jessica Adrian providing live commentary as Linda's months of harassment literally sank into the muddy water below my completely undamaged bridge. This is unprecedented footage of what appears to be a complete infrastructure failure during an unauthorized demolition attempt, Adrian announced to her camera, documenting Linda's meltdown for the evening news, and probably YouTube immortality. Sheriff's Deputy Rodriguez approached Linda with handcuffs and the patient expression of someone who'd seen desperate people make spectacularly bad decisions before. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for reckless endangerment, property destruction, and violation of emergency protection orders." "This is impossible," Linda screamed as the handcuffs clicked into place. "That bridge is unsafe. The road was supposed to hold. The permits were supposed to work." "Roads are supposed to hold normal traffic, ma'am, not concrete trucks driven by real estate agents having mental breakdowns," Deputy Rodriguez replied, with the flat delivery of someone stating obvious facts to someone who'd temporarily lost touch with reality. I stood on my grandfather's bridge, completely intact, solid as bedrock, exactly as it had been built in 1897, watching emergency crews assess the damage Linda had inflicted on her own infrastructure. The bridge hadn't suffered so much as a scuff mark, while Linda's approach road looked like it had been bombed by an engineering textbook. Eleanor appeared beside me with a thermos of coffee and the satisfied expression of someone who just watched justice served with scientific precision. "How's that working out for her?" she asked, nodding toward Linda being loaded into the sheriff's department vehicle. "About like you'd expect when someone tries to use brute force to solve a physics problem," I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. The irony was perfect. Linda had spent months claiming my bridge was unsafe, then destroyed her own infrastructure trying to prove her point. Physics had rendered its verdict on who actually understood engineering, and the results were being broadcast live on local television. My grandfather's bridge remained exactly where it belonged, spanning Willow Creek like a stone testament to the difference between real engineering and expensive stupidity. 6 months later, I stood on my grandfather's bridge, watching the last of the cleanup crews remove Linda's concrete truck from Willow Creek. The morning air smelled like creek mist and wild mint again, free from the industrial fog that had marked Linda's brief reign of mechanical terror. The legal aftermath had been swift and expensive for everyone except me. Linda pleaded guilty to reckless endangerment, destruction of public property, and embezzlement of HOA funds. Her house went into foreclosure to pay restitution, while CDC's development project died in a maze of environmental violations and permit cancellations. The new HOA board, led by Eleanor with her practical wisdom and suspicious nature, had installed actual financial oversight and eliminated Linda's more creative interpretations of neighborhood governance. Mailbox colors were no longer regulated, and elderly residents stopped living in fear of violation notices for having the wrong shade of roses. My bridge achieved something my grandfather never could have imagined: internet fame. Jessica Adrian's footage of Linda's concrete truck disaster had gone viral, accumulating over 3 million views under the title, "Karen Tries to Destroy Historic Bridge. Physics Disagrees." The comment section had become a support group for people dealing with their own HOA nightmares. More importantly, the publicity had attracted attention from the Colorado Historical Society, which provided a grant to restore the bridge's original stonework and install interpretive signs explaining 19th century engineering techniques. I found myself giving tours to engineering students who wanted to understand how structures built with hand tools could outlast modern construction. The creek restoration project had exceeded everyone's expectations. With Linda's concrete obstruction removed and natural drainage patterns restored, fish populations had recovered dramatically. The native columbines my grandmother had planted were spreading along the banks, creating a wildflower corridor that attracted photographers and nature lovers from across the region. I had established the Sarah Blackwood Memorial Engineering Scholarship, funded partly by my consulting work and partly by unexpected donations from people who'd seen the viral video. The scholarship supported students studying historic preservation and sustainable engineering practices. Eleanor had become my unofficial co-administrator, screening applications with the same sharp attention to detail she'd used to expose Linda's financial schemes. Together, we'd selected 12 recipients who were now studying everything from medieval bridge construction to renewable energy systems. The bridge itself had become a symbol of resistance to both corporate development and bureaucratic overreach. I regularly received emails from people fighting their own battles against HOA tyranny, seeking advice on everything from legal strategy to soil mechanics. I'd started a blog called Physics versus Politics that combined engineering education with practical advice for property owners dealing with unreasonable neighbors. The most satisfying development was the community festival that had grown around the bridge's newfound fame. The annual Stone Bridge Days celebration featured live music, local food vendors, and engineering demonstrations that attracted families from throughout Colorado. Children learned to build model arch bridges while their parents enjoyed Eleanor's famous berry pie and listened to stories about the old mining days. I often found myself thinking about my grandfather during these celebrations, imagining the old man's pride at seeing his handiwork surrounded by laughter and learning instead of diesel fumes and destruction. The bridge had become exactly what it was always meant to be, a connection between past and future, bringing the community together rather than driving it apart. On quiet mornings like this one, I would walk across the stone arch and remember why I'd moved here in the first place. The creek bubbled over smooth stones with the same sound my grandfather had heard, unchanged by Linda's industrial assault or the decades that had passed since those strong hands first fitted these stones together. The bridge would outlast them all. Linda, CDC, probably even the subdivision itself. It was built to last not because it was stronger than everything else, but because it worked with natural forces instead of fighting them. Sometimes the best revenge was simply being right, especially when physics was keeping score. My phone buzzed with a notification. Another HOA horror story submission for my blog. Another neighbor asking for engineering advice. Another request for bridge tours. I smiled and headed home to answer my correspondence. There were more bridges to save, more physics lessons to teach, and more community connections to build. After all, that's what bridges were for.
You know, what really got me about this whole thing? It wasn't the $300,000 Linda borrowed against her house. It wasn't even watching that concrete truck disappear into the creek like some kind of very expensive submarine. It was how quiet everything got afterward. For 8 months, she'd been the loudest voice in the neighborhood. Violations notices, emergency meetings, phone calls to contractors at 6 in the morning. Linda made noise because noise was power, and then suddenly nothing. That's the thing about people who mistake volume for authority. When the volume goes away, there's usually nothing left underneath. Linda spent too much energy trying to control one-man bridge. Thus, she forgot to control her own finances, her own legal exposure, her own basic common sense. That concrete trucks sitting in the creek bed, that wasn't just equipment failure. That's what happens when someone confused being in charge with actually knowing what they are doing. But here's that keeps me thinking about this story. Linda almost won. If she's hadn't gone too far. If she just got stuck to fries and legal harassment. She might ground him down eventually. Most people don't have the expertise to fight back the way he did. So, How many of you are dealing with someone like Linda right now? Someone who learned that HOA rules are just another way to control people who can't afford to fight back. Hit that like button if you enjoy watching physics settle a legal dispute. Subscribe for more stories about regular folks who refuse to back down. And remember, the loudest person in the room is usually compensating for something.